The morning Clint Rasmussen walked into the Hettinger County Recorder's office, he had the expression of a man who expected to prove a point. He was carrying a printout of the 2009 assessed values, fresh off the county's website, and he had driven the 11 miles from Mott into Regent with the windows down, even though it was October and cold enough to see his breath in the parking lot. He had been telling anyone who would listen for the better part of 40 years that Wayne Ford got taken on that section out by the Cedar Creek breaks. And now, with Wayne formally retired and the land rolled into the county's updated assessment rolls, Clint had apparently decided it was time to get the public record to confirm what he had been saying all along. The woman at the recorder's counter that morning was named Phyllis, and she had worked that office since 1987. She pulled the parcel record without being asked twice. She read the assessed value aloud in the flat, unhurried voice of someone reciting a grocery list. $1,240 per acre. 800 acres total. Aggregate assessed value, $992,000. Clint stood at that counter for a long moment without saying anything. He had driven to Regent to prove a point, and the county's own records had just made the opposite one. Wayne Ford was not in that office. He was at home, at the kitchen table, drinking coffee with the same white ceramic mug he had used since 1972. Darlene was across from him with her hands around her own cup, and on the table between them was a wire-bound notebook with a faded green cover, its pages swollen from years of handling, the spine repaired twice with electrical tape. Wayne did not know what Clint was doing in Regent that morning. He did not need to know. The numbers were in the county record now, and the county record did not care what anyone thought of them. Let me take you back to where this started. It was the spring of 1964 in Hettinger County, North Dakota, and the land that would become Section 14 of Dawson Township had been sitting on Clint Rasmussen's listing sheet for 14 months without a single serious offer. Clint was 31 years old that year, new enough to the real estate business to still be a little hungry, but already comfortable enough to have opinions about what kind of property was worth a man's time. He had grown up around farmland and knew what good ground looked like. Section 14 did not look like good ground. It was 640 acres of alkali flats and clay hardpan, low in the middle, where the drainage had nowhere to go, white and crusty along the creek margins, where the sodium had come to the surface and killed off anything finer than crested wheatgrass. The few native grass stands that had survived were sparse enough to count by the clump. The soil had a smell to it after rain, a sharp mineral smell that the older farmers in the county recognized without needing it explained. This was land that had never been kind, not even when the country was first turned. Clint had priced it at $11 per acre and had quietly expected it to sit until someone bought it for a tax write-off. Wayne Ford showed up at Clint's office on a Thursday afternoon in early April. He was 37 years old, lean in the way that men get lean from working rather than from watching what they eat, and he came in wearing a canvas jacket that had a repaired tear along the left shoulder. He drove a 1958 Dodge pickup that Clint had seen parked around the county for years and privately considered an embarrassment. Wayne did not waste time on pleasantries. He asked to see the plat map for Section 14. He asked how much the back taxes were. He asked whether the seller would take cash at the listed price. Clint told him the cash price was $7,040 for the full 640 acres, and that the back taxes were settled in the deal. He said it in the polite, slightly slowed-down way that people use when they are not sure the person across the desk has fully understood the situation. Then he said, "Wayne, I have to be straight with you. That ground is not going to produce for you. I have had 2 men look at it who knew their soils, and both of them said the same thing. You would be better served putting that money into something you can actually work. Wayne thanked him for his time, placed $7,040 in cash on the desk in an envelope, and asked for the deed to be prepared. Clint took the money, he filed the deed, and on the drive home that evening, sitting in that Dodge with the window cracked and the plains spread out flat and gray in every direction, Wayne Ford was not thinking about what Clint Rasmussen had said about the ground's potential. He was thinking about a different set of men and a different kind of ground, and a morning in 1937 when he had stood at the edge of his father's farm and watched the sheriff nail a notice to the door. Wayne's father, Earl, had farmed 480 acres near Regent under a mortgage taken out in the late 1920s, during the years when the land banks were still flush and the wheat prices looked like they might hold. They had not held, and Earl, who was a careful man in most respects, had borrowed at 4% on a note that came due in 1934 and could not be extended. Wayne was 10 years old when the notice went up. He stood in the yard and watched his father read that paper twice, fold it, and put it in his shirt pocket, and he never forgot the particular flatness that came over his father's face in that moment. Not anger, not grief, something quieter than both. The expression of a man who had just discovered that the bank's arithmetic and his own could arrive at entirely different conclusions without anyone having lied. Earl Ford rented a smaller place for the next 6 years and paid cash for everything he used. When he saved enough to buy a quarter section in 1946, he paid cash for that too. He kept a brown leather wallet folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth, and inside the wallet was a stub of pencil and a piece of paper with his running balance written on it, in numbers so small they were hard to read in dim light. Wayne grew up watching that wallet come out of his father's front pocket every time a purchase decision needed to be made. Not to show anyone, just to look at the number and put it back. Earl died in 1959, and the quarter section transferred to Wayne, clear and free. That quarter, and the memory of that folded paper, and the specific sound of a notice being tacked to a door in the cold quiet of a March morning in 1937, were the things Wayne Ford carried into Clint Rasmussen's office in April of 1964. The reclamation of Section 14 began that same spring. This is the part of the story that does not photograph well and is hard to explain to someone who has not done it. Wayne started by walking the section on foot with a soil probe and a mason jar, pulling cores at 20-yard intervals and capping the jar, and writing the location and depth on a strip of masking tape. He filled 2 cardboard boxes with those jars and sent them to the State Extension Service in Bismarck for a pH analysis. The results came back in a manila envelope 6 weeks later. The sodium content was high enough in 3 distinct zones that conventional wheat seeding would have been a waste of time and money. The drainage problem was not a lack of rainfall. It was the hardpan layer 14 to 18 inches down, impermeable as poured concrete, which caused any moisture that reached it to sit and concentrate salt near the surface. Wayne had read about gypsum treatment in an extension bulletin that Gus Dillard had left on the co-op counter the previous winter. The calcium in agricultural gypsum displaces sodium in the soil exchange sites and allows it to leach downward when drainage is improved. The drainage had to come first. You could not flush the sodium anywhere if the water had nowhere to go. He began tiling that June. He rented a tile plow from a man over in Adams County and laid clay tile by hand across 11 drainage runs, each one sloped at a consistent grade toward the low center of the section where he had cut a main outlet to Cedar Creek. He hauled gypsum in 50-pound bags in the bed of the Dodge spreading it by hand along the worst of the alkali zones, while Darlene drove the truck in low gear across the flat ground. She kept a wire-bound notebook on the seat beside her that first summer, writing down the location of each treated area and the application rate and the date, the pH reading from the mason jar cores, and the date of the extension lab results. It was her idea to number the zones and cross-reference them on a rough pencil map tucked into the back cover. Wayne did not ask her to do this. She simply understood that the only way to know if the treatment was working was to know what you had started with. They seeded cover crops in the fall of 1964, sweet clover in the better drain zones, which would fix nitrogen and loosen the soil structure over 2 winters. Where the hardpan was worse, they seeded crested wheatgrass and left it alone. This work was not glamorous. It was not fast. And for the first several years, Section 14 looked from the road exactly like what Clint Rasmussen had always said it was. Clint was not shy about saying it. The co-op in Regent had a long wooden counter along the south wall and a row of stools where the farmers would sit on Saturday mornings with coffee, watching whoever walked in. It was the kind of informal court that existed in every small grain town in the northern plains, and nothing passed through it without comment. By the fall of 1965, Clint had begun making a point of mentioning Wayne's section whenever the conversation turned to land values or soil quality. He would shake his head in that particular way, not cruel, just regretful, the way a man shakes his head when he sees someone make a purchase he knows they will come to regret. Old Wayne's out there spreading gypsum on that alkali ground, he told the counter one October morning. He might as well be salting his own soup. A man named Ferris, who ran the feed account, laughed at that. A couple of others smiled into their coffee. Nobody disagreed. Wayne heard about it. People in Hettinger County were not malicious, but they were not private either. He heard about it from Dale Harmon, his neighbor to the north, who told him one evening at the fuel pump with the specific embarrassed kindness of a man who figures you need to know but wishes he did not have to be the one to say it. Dale was a broad-shouldered man, 5 years younger than Wayne, who farmed 640 acres of good tillable ground his father had left him, and was in the process of doing very well with it. The late 1960s were reasonable years for wheat in the northern plains. Dale drove a new pickup every 3 years. He had a Farmall 806 diesel that he kept in a heated shop. He and his wife Kay had put an addition on their house in 1967, matching brick, and the kitchen was new and the furnace was new and the insulation was 2 inches thick. Dale told Wayne about Clint's remark at the co-op and then said, not unkindly, "You need anything over there, Wayne? Anything you need?" Darlene and Kay were talking, and she said the tiling is about got you to the bottom of the savings. Wayne said the savings were fine. He said it without looking up from the fuel nozzle. Dale believed him, or was too polite to say otherwise, and the matter was dropped. The savings, to be precise, were not comfortable. The gypsum, the tile, the cover crop seed, the mason jars and the extension fees and the fuel had cost close to $3,000 by 1966, which was more than a third of what Wayne had paid for the land itself. Darlene's notebook tracked every dollar. Some evenings she would open it at the kitchen table and sit with the pencil in her hand for a while before writing anything down, adding the running total at the bottom of the column. She did not tell Wayne she was worried, but he saw her hand on the pencil, and he knew what the pause meant. He was not without doubt. That is worth saying plainly. There were evenings in the late 1960s when the progress on the section was slow, and the wheat prices were modest, and the Dodge needed a rear axle, bearing that cost $42 they did not have loose. He sat at that kitchen table with his own coffee and his own silence, and ran his father's arithmetic in his head, Earl's way of looking at the number in the wallet. The question was not whether the land would come around. He believed it would, based on the extension data and the pH readings Darlene was logging each season. The question was whether they could afford to keep working it until it did. They could. Barely and without comfort. But they could. By 1969, the cover crops had improved the structure in 2 of the 3 worst zones enough that Darlene's pH readings showed movement. The surface layers were dropping toward the range where winter wheat could establish. Wayne seeded 40 acres experimentally in the fall of 1969. He lost 20 of them to a hard freeze before the crown roots had set. The other 20 came through and yielded 22 bushels per acre in 1970, which was enough to pay the seed back and a little more. He seeded 80 acres in the fall of 1970. They came through. He seeded 180 acres in the fall of 1971, pulling back only the zones where Darlene's notebook still showed sodium readings above 8.5. That crop went in clean and came off clean in the summer of 1972. 38 bushels per acre on 180 acres of ground that Clint Rasmussen had sold for $11 on the certainty that it would never produce. Wayne did not go to the co-op to announce this. He pulled the wheat, waited at the elevator, deposited the check at the First National Bank in Regent, and drove home. Darlene wrote the yield number in the notebook and underlined it once. If you are keeping arithmetic in your head, let me tell you where the number stood. $7,040 paid for the land in 1964. Roughly $3,000 in reclamation costs through 1966 with modest additional costs through 1971. The 1972 wheat crop at market price came back at just over $11,000 gross, with roughly $3,000 in operating costs. The net for that single season exceeded the total purchase price of the land. The land was not paid for with debt. It was paid for with cash and time and a wire-bound notebook. Those are different kinds of payment, and they leave a different kind of residue. The middle years of the 1970s were good years on the northern plains, and they made some people bold. Dale Harmon was among them. By 1974, Dale was farming his original 640 acres cleanly, and had been watching land values move upward for 3 consecutive years. The county assessment rolls were rising. The local banker, a man named Hollenbeck at the First National, was telling good customers that land at current values was a sound basis for expansion. Dale borrowed against his 4 quarters, putting up the 640 acres he had inherited as collateral at 9% interest on a 10-year note. He used the proceeds to purchase 2 additional quarters at $420 per acre, which was elevated but defensible by 1974 standards. He also financed a new tractor, a new grain drill, and a grain bin expansion. Wayne noticed Dale's new combine sitting in the yard that fall and said nothing. He was at the co-op counter that same season when Clint Rasmussen came in and stopped to see who was there. Clint looked around the group, saw Wayne, and said, loud enough for the counter to hear, "Wayne, I heard you actually got some wheat off that alkali ground. What did you end up spending to get that, about $20 an acre in inputs?" He said it with a grin, the kind of grin that makes a question sound like a compliment, while meaning something else. Wayne looked at Clint for a moment and said, "Some." The counter chuckled. Clint said, "Well, at least it grows something, I guess." Wayne took his seed receipt and left. Here is what the notebook said about that year. Section 14 was producing wheat on 240 acres. By 1975, with the remaining 400 acres in a managed rotation of cover crops and restored native grass that Wayne was beginning to graze modestly with a small beef herd. The pH in the 3 original problem zones had dropped to workable levels in 2 of them. Darlene had started a second notebook for the grass and livestock records. The Dodge had been replaced in 1971 with a 1968 GMC half-ton that Wayne had bought from a man in Mott for $400 cash and had repaired himself. It had 119,000 miles on it when he bought it, and no one would have guessed it was worth the $400 unless they knew what was under the hood. The rate spike arrived the way those things do, not with drama, but with paperwork. By late 1980, the Federal Reserve had raised the prime rate to levels that had no precedent in modern farming. Dale Harmon's 9% note was fixed, which offered some protection. But the operating line he renewed each spring was variable, and by the spring of 1981, he was paying 18% on borrowed operating money. He needed that operating line. He had expanded into land and equipment he could not run without credit for seed and fuel and chemical. He had built a structure that required everything to go right, and 18% interest was not everything going right. Wayne received a letter from Hollenbeck at the First National that same spring, a form letter about operating line terms, and set it aside. He had no operating line. He had never opened one. He bought his seed and fuel each fall out of the previous season's revenue, setting aside the next year's operating costs before he counted what was left over. The first notice of Dale's trouble came in the spring of 1983. A quarter section on the north side of Dale's ground went to sheriff's auction in April. It was the parcel Dale had purchased in 1974, one of the 2 he had borrowed against his original ground to buy. It brought $210 per acre at auction, against an outstanding loan balance that Hollenbeck was not publicly specific about, but which the county could read in the general shape of the outcome. It was a small catastrophe, dressed in the quiet language of auction proceedings. Dale was at the auction. Wayne was there too, buying a set of used cultivator shovels from the equipment table. He and Dale stood 20 feet apart for most of the morning, not speaking, in the specific way that men in a small county manage the courtesy of not witnessing each other's difficulties directly. At one point, Dale walked past, and Wayne said, "Dale." Dale said, "Wayne." And that was the whole of it. The second quarter went in the fall of 1984, the third in 1985. Dale had managed to hold the fourth, his original home quarter, through the middle years by renting out his equipment and cutting every cost he could find. The fourth quarter went in the spring of 1987. He and Kay moved into town. Dale took a job with the county road department and came to the fuel pump one evening that fall, looking 20 years older than he had in 1974, when the land values were climbing and the banker was friendly and everything that looked like prosperity was real. He and Wayne stood at the pump in the October cold, and Dale said quietly, "I should have asked you what you were doing over there with that section, back when I had time to listen." Wayne looked at the fuel gauge and said, "You were doing all right." "I was spending what I didn't have," Dale said. "That's a different thing." Wayne did not correct him or comfort him beyond what he had already said. There was nothing to add that would have helped. Gus Dillard had been watching Section 14 since 1976, when he stopped by to ask Wayne about the gypsum program, and ended up sitting at the kitchen table for 2 hours, with one of Darlene's notebooks open in front of him. Gus was a deliberate man who did not speak quickly and did not arrive at conclusions without data, which is exactly the kind of person you want when the data being evaluated is your own soil. He had made a point of stopping at the Ford place each year after that, comparing current readings to the baseline Darlene had set in 1964, and by the early 1980s he had a longitudinal record of alkali reclamation on Section 14 that was, as he told Wayne, probably the cleanest documented case study of its kind in the state. In 1988, Gus published a regional soil management study through the North Dakota Agricultural Extension Service. Section 14, Dawson Township, Hettinger County, was cited as a reclamation benchmark. The specific pH trend data Darlene had compiled across more than 2 decades was used as the primary field record for the sodium displacement analysis. Her notebooks were not credited by name because Gus had asked and Darlene had said she did not need her name in a bulletin. But the data was hers and Gus knew it, and he told Wayne so. Wayne read the bulletin once, set it on the hutch beside Darlene's notebooks, and went out to check the winter wheat. In 1991, a 160-acre parcel adjoining Section 14 on the east side came up at foreclosure auction. It had been part of a larger holding that had gone through the same unraveling as Dale Harmon's ground, and it was offered at a price that reflected 3 years of depressed land values and nobody in the county with loose cash. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in October in the parking lot of the elevator in Regent. Dale Harmon was there, working a county road crew job that kept him from being inside on cold mornings, and he stood near the back of the small crowd. Wayne bid $140 per acre. Nobody else bid. The 160 acres transferred to Wayne Ford for $22,400 cash. Dale found him afterward by the trucks and said, "Goodbye." Wayne said, "Fair." "I wish I'd bought the section next to mine when I had the chance," Dale said. Wayne said, "You'll know next time." It was about as much as either of them said on the subject, but it was the moment their relationship shifted from courtesy to something more like understanding. Dale began stopping by the Ford place when he had a question about soil or drainage or where to find a good deal on used tile, and Wayne would answer him plainly and without making anything of the past. They were never close in the way of close friends, but they were honest with each other after 1991, and in a small county, that counts for a lot. The expanded holding, 800 acres total after the 1991 purchase, ran quietly through the 1990s and into the first years of the new century. Wayne was in his 60s by then, and moving somewhat more slowly than he had when he was hand-spreading gypsum in the summer heat, and Darlene had started keeping the household ledger on a small adding machine at the kitchen table, rather than entirely in her head. Their son, Greg, had come back from 2 years of agricultural college in Fargo and was doing the majority of the field work by 2001. He was a careful young man who had read his mother's notebooks and who asked questions the way Wayne had always asked them, specific and without theater. In 2003, Wayne transferred 320 acres of Section 14 to Greg. The agreed price was $180 per acre, which was below the going county value, but not a gift. Wayne carried the note himself at 0 interest, payable over 15 years in annual installments, which worked out to $3,840 per year on a total transfer price of $57,600. Greg made the first payment in March of 2004 and did not miss one after that. Wayne said, when the papers were signed at the kitchen table with Darlene and the county extension records and a cup of coffee, "Don't borrow against it. That's the only condition." Greg said, "I know, Dad." Wayne said, "Mo, say it." Greg said, "I won't borrow against it." Wayne nodded and picked up his coffee. Clint Rasmussen was still selling real estate in Hettinger County in 2003, though at a somewhat reduced pace now that he was past 70. He had heard through the county grapevine, as he always heard things, about the transfer to Greg. He had said at the fuel pump in Regent, in the hearing of at least 3 people who would eventually tell Wayne, "Well, Wayne always was sentimental. Giving away ground at below market, he could have sold that to a real buyer and actually cashed in on his luck." It was the third time on record that Clint had applied a diminishing label to Wayne's ownership of Section 14. And this time, the word he chose was luck. The first time, in 1964, it was foolish. The second time, at the co-op in 1975, it was costly. The third time, in 2003, it was luck. The word that had never appeared in connection with Section 14, in the county records or in Darlene's notebooks or in Gus Dillard's soil bulletin or in any conversation Wayne Ford had ever chosen to have about it, was worthless. But that word had been in the air for 40 years, and Clint had put it there. Wayne retired from active fieldwork in 2009. Greg was farming 480 acres of the 800, with the remaining 320 carrying grass and a 60-head beef operation that Darlene tracked in the fourth of her notebooks, the newest one. This one with a blue cover and a spine that was still tight. The county assessor's updated rolls for 2009 reflected a land market that had been moving steadily upward since the late 1990s, driven by ethanol demand and rising commodity prices, and the growing recognition that northern plains cropland, even ground that had been reclaimed from alkali, was a productive and finite resource. The assessed value on Section 14 and the 1991 parcel combined came to $1,240 per acre across 800 acres. That was the number Phyllis read aloud at the recorder's counter in October of 2009 when Clint Rasmussen brought in his printout. $992,000 assessed. The actual market value, had Wayne chosen to sell, would have been higher. Let me tell you what happened at that counter because it is a small scene and a quiet one, and it matters. Phyllis read the number. Clint looked at the printout in his hand, and then at the screen, and then at the printout again. He said, "That's the whole parcel? All 800 acres?" Phyllis said it was. Clint said, He stood there another moment. Phyllis had seen enough men stand at that counter processing unexpected information that she did not rush him. He folded the printout, put it in his coat pocket, and said, before he left, "Well, Wayne always did work hard." That was Clint's version of a correction. It was not quite an apology, and it was not quite an admission, but it was all the revision that a man who had been publicly wrong for 40 years about a piece of ground was prepared to offer at a government counter on an October morning. Phyllis wrote nothing in the margin of the record. She did not need to. The number was already there. Gus Dillard was retired by 2009, but had kept in touch with Wayne throughout the decade, stopping by the farm in summer when he was out that way. He had heard about the 2009 assessed value through the usual county channels and had telephoned Wayne from his home in Bismarck to say, plainly, that it was a fine result and that the data Darlene had kept across those years had contributed to how 3 other farmers in the state had approached their own alkali ground, none of whom knew the name of the woman who had started the record in a wire-bound notebook in the summer of 1964. Wayne thanked him and asked how his knee was doing. Gus said the knee was acceptable. Wayne said that was fine then. That was the entire call. By the time the afternoon light was slanting low across Section 14 that October, Greg was in the field checking on the last of the fall cover crop seeding, moving along the drainage tile runs that his father had laid by hand 45 years before, in some places following exactly the same path his father's boots had worn into the clay hardpan. The alkali zones that had shown pH readings above 9.0 in 1964 were reading between 6.8 and 7.2 by the early 2000s. Productive ground, working ground, ground that carried a mortgage to no one, and a debt to nothing except the years of attention that had been paid into it. Wayne sat at the kitchen table after Gus's call, both hands around the ceramic mug, and looked at the hutch against the wall. Darlene's notebooks were still in the bottom drawer, 4 of them now, each one labeled in her careful handwriting on the spine. The green-covered first one was swollen from 20 years of handling in the field before she had retired it to the drawer. The electrical tape repairs on the spine had gone brittle, but the tape was still holding. Darlene came in from the back room and sat across from him with her own coffee, the way she had done at this table since they had bought the place in 1961. She did not ask about the phone call. She could read the particular quality of Wayne's silence well enough to know whether it called for a question. After a while, she said, "Was that Gus?" Wayne said it was. She said, "And?" Wayne said, "He said the data you kept was used by other people. 3 farms." Darlene looked at her coffee. After a moment, she said, "I didn't know that." Wayne said, "He thought you'd want to." Outside, the field ran flat toward the Cedar Creek breaks. The cover crop a thin green haze over the dark soil. The cattle visible as dark shapes near the east fence line. Dale Harmon drove past on the county road in a late-model pickup, slowing briefly the way he always did when he passed the Ford place, a habit he had developed sometime after 1991 that meant nothing in particular except that he had stopped pretending the place was not there. He kept going, and the dust settled. Wayne watched the pickup until it turned out of sight. Then he looked at the mug in his hands. This is the arithmetic that the land had been keeping quietly since 1964. $7,040 to purchase. Roughly $5,000 in reclamation costs through 1971. 4.5 decades of wheat harvests, grazing revenue, and steady ownership, all of it untaxed by interest payments to any bank. 160 acres added in 1991 for $22,400, cash. 320 acres transferred to a son at 0 interest, with the note being retired cleanly. 800 acres of northern plains ground carrying a county-assessed value of just under $1 million, free and clear. $11 an acre, paid in cash in 1964, by a man in a repaired canvas jacket, driving a truck that Clint Rasmussen privately considered an embarrassment. The worthless word had been Clint's word, applied to ground he had sold and promptly stopped believing in. It had never appeared in the deed. It had never appeared in Darlene's notebooks. It had never appeared in Gus Dillard's soil bulletin, or in the county assessor's rolls, or in any of the documents that described what Section 14 actually was. Patient work, faithfully recorded. That was the only description the land had ever required. The carry note from the 2003 transfer was 2 years from being retired. Greg would own his 320 acres free and clear by 2018, and he knew without being told what the condition of that ownership was. He had said so at the kitchen table in front of his parents, and Wayne had nodded, and Darlene had written the payment terms in the 4th notebook on the same day. Wayne Ford would live 6 more years after that October morning. He died in 2015 at the kitchen table, as his family had gathered for the kind of ordinary evening that families on working farms have together. Not a ceremony, just a meal, and afterward a quietness. His boots were by the door. The ceramic mug was in the dish rack. The deed to Section 14, clear since 1964, was in the fireproof box under the bedroom floorboards where it had always been, alongside his father's folded leather wallet, soft as cloth, with the stub of pencil still inside. Darlene set the green-covered notebook on the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. She did not open it. She rested one hand on the swollen cover, on the electrical tape across the spine, and sat for a while in the particular silence that a house holds when it has been full of people and is now quiet again. The land outside was dark and level. Section 14 ran to the horizon the way it always had, indifferent and patient, keeping its accounts in the language of soil pH and drainage slope, and the slow chemistry of calcium displacing sodium in the exchange sites 12 inches below the frost line. It did not require anyone to speak well of it. It had the deed. That was enough.